theophanies. We're going to look at a couple of the biggies today. We're going to talk about the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. Now, as I mentioned to the kids, John always calls these signs, and they are what we call miracles, but I really like the word theophany, partly because it's really fun to say. A theophany happens when God makes God's self known to us in some way. So the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle or theophany or sign that is in all four Gospels. In each of these four accounts, some variation of this is told. Today we're going to look at John's version, which then leads directly into the story about Jesus walking on water, as one does. All right. John 6, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to give a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the word of God for the people of God today. So in those first verses, we learned Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee, and the author points out this is also called the Sea of Tiberias. We're going to get more detail on that later. So the feeding of the 5,000. Each gospel writer tells it slightly differently. In John's gospel, Jesus turns to Philip, and Philip helpfully points out there is no way we can feed this many people. We don't have the money. Andrew, another disciple, tells Jesus about a little boy who has barley loaves and some dried fish. Ew. Well, many of you know how I feel about fish, but anyway. But barley loaves were the food of the poorest of the poor. It smelled bad and basically had no flavor. In other words, nobody's going to trade their Twinkie for what this kid's got in his little lunchbox. So, throughout human history, the people who can distribute or withhold food are the people with power. Hoarding resources is probably one of the most persistent ways that people in power hang on to power. Which takes us back to that little comment about the Sea of Galilee also being called the Sea of Tiberias. Those three little words, see of Tiberius, that's a whole social, political, and economic commentary in those three words. Tiberias was a city built by Herod Antipas. Herod worked basically with the Romans as governor of the Jews. So he was a Jew technically, but he was pretty much looking for Roman favor. This is also the same Herod who killed John the Baptist, who married his brother's wife, and who had his sons killed so that he could stay on the throne. So he's just a real gem of a guy. Tiberias is a city that Herod built to facilitate trade with the Gentiles. Now that trade benefited Herod, but not most of the rank and file of Jewish people. Trading with the Gentiles for his own benefit was a betrayal of his fellow Jews. Tiberias was a city that was built on a Jewish graveyard, which is a defilement of sacred things. The economic impact of Tiberias was part of the oppression of small family farms and gradually resulted in them losing their land because of ever-increasing taxes. Finally, there had recently, before this, been this economic crash that drove the price of food way up and wages way down. So if we think that economics didn't really happen, they sure did. So when we hear about a crowd coming to see Jesus with the reference of Tiberias, we can read between the lines, and we see these people are hungry, they're dispossessed, and they're under the thumb of a man who's willing to build cities on graveyards. In Jesus, they saw an alternative to Herod. They saw a possibility of a sign that their God still cared about them and their reality. So here's Jesus, looking into the faces of these poor and hungry people. There were likely many more than 5,000 because they would have only counted the men. Even if these are all exaggerations, there's still a whole lot of people, more than 5 barley loaves and 2 fish are going to feed. So how did that little boy's lunch feed all those people? On the one hand, if Jesus could turn water into wine, he could probably make the barley bread taste better. And he could make sure there's plenty of it. No problem. But what if Jesus changed the people? What if Jesus changed the people instead of the food? Which would be harder? Which would be more of a miracle? I came across this writing by a pastor named Stan Duncan. And he imagined a way this may have happened that was less magical, but far more miraculous. Here's how he put it. Jesus took the little boy and he set him in front of the crowd and said, hey, all of you, listen up, look up here, focus. Okay. Now I know that all of you are very poor. All of you have felt like you've been caught up in the economic crash that drove up the prices of food and drove down your income. We all know that. And all of you are afraid that you don't have enough even to survive on your own, and you're afraid to spend anything. Now, I'm not going to give you some long lecture about Keynesian economics and how major financial powers need to step in and invest and spend and on until the smallest folks can get their faith and trust and security back. Rome may get around doing something like that one of these days, but who knows? Until then, we're going to try something else. Something that might be a model for the government might work out better for you in the long run. Something that might actually bring the kingdom that I've been talking so much about into me. I'm going to put this little kid out front here with his, frankly, pretty dismal offering for all of you to look at. He's saying that he's offering to give us everything he's got, and I want you to see that. And then I'm going to break up his smelly bread and give thanks to God, and then start distributing it to all of you, and then you will, well, I don't know. Let's just see what happens after that. All right? Got it? Don't let me down. So bow your heads, I'm going to pray. And Jesus starts praying. Stan Duncan continues with this. And then, I think, as the bits and pieces of food are handed down the aisle, one person starts to think to himself, you know, the wife did make me this sandwich and packed me this thermos of coffee, and I probably don't need all of it, so I'll break it down and pass it down with the barley loaves as it comes handed down the aisle to me. And then the next guy says, well, I do have this banana, and I forgot to check at the gate when I came in, and I don't need all of it. So he breaks it in half and passes it down. And then there's the guy who picked up a box of Oreos at the 7-Eleven that morning on the way out of town to the rally. And the one who won the turkey at the meat raffle at the range meeting last night. And the one who remembers he still has a piece of that fruitcake left over from the office party a couple of years ago. It never went bad. And so on, all down the line, until all the loaves and fishes had been passed around, and the disciples gathered up the scraps and found 12 baskets full of leftovers and snacks. So less magical, but maybe more miraculous. If Pastor Duncan is right, maybe Jesus wasn't so much creating tons of bread out of those loaves, so much as Jesus was changing people, changing hearts and minds and behavior in some amazing ways. A little later, the disciples head out on the boat. They get several miles out from shore, and a great wind comes up. Through the dark and the gloom and the struggle to keep rowing in that wind, Jesus strolls across the water to them, and they're terrified. Jesus basically says to them, oh, hey, it's me. No need to freak out. And the writer of the Gospel of John seems to imply, though, the appropriate response to a theophany like this, the appropriate response to Jesus walking on the water, is fear, because they're experiencing God's presence. And that's worth probably freaking out about. And Jesus gets in the boat, and then all of a sudden they're where they were intending to be. So Jesus has already disrupted the food and economic systems with this massive meal. Now he's showing us storms at sea, or even gravity, where the laws of physics are not going to stop him from fulfilling his mission. I wish I had some kind of explanation how this worked. I don't. I would have been just as terrified as the disciples, just as awed and overwhelmed by these two miracles, these two theophanies of God's interaction with and care for us in what Jesus did that day. So, we as Christians believe that Jesus is God in human form. And if Jesus shows us who God is, what do these stories tell us about God? What are the theophanies within these stories? First, that God is remarkably generous. That God cares if we're hungry. That God sees possibilities in what we bring, even when all we have is smelly bread and dry fish. That God is not bound by the laws of physics as we are. And that God, like Jesus, will cross through the storms in our lives to be with us in our boats. And that when we encounter God, we are changed. Sometimes theophanies do show up in miraculous ways. Sometimes there's healing. Sometimes the much-needed money shows up just in time to prevent financial ruin. But a lot of the time, if we look for it, Jesus shows up in a conversation over a shared meal. There are plenty of theophanies in the laughter shared with friends and family. Those of you with children know there are plenty of theophanies in those bedtime conversations, or at least 2 questions. I believe there are a lot of theophanies in working together as we are to create a church family where people wounded by the church can test the waters of faith again. They can be surrounded by people who get it, and they can heal. I want to invite you to keep watching for theophanies. They might terrify us, but they might also feed us, calm us during the storms, and get us safely where we're headed.